This is the part 4 of our discussion about rules and expectations and procedures and consequences. So here's a picture of the way that I posted my expectations for my students when I taught 7th and 8th grade. And I actually took this picture in my office because I still had the posters. So if you are wondering, well, how do I post these? These are just made out of very simple materials, construction paper, and some printouts that's 2 pieces of paper joined together. And I had 3 sets of these. I had one set at the back of my classroom, one set on the wall where the pencil sharpener was, so that if you're sharpening your pencil, this is what you saw in front of you. And then I had a set near my desk, and that way if I needed to talk to a student one-on-one, I could bring them up to my desk and we could see the expectations and talk about them if we needed to. And then my set of consequences were there also. And we're about to talk about consequences. If you look very closely, you'll see that I have a little bit of negative language in there. So this was made in my first year or second year of teaching or so. And if I had to do this again with kids, I would take that out. But I did want to point it out to you. One year I let all the students make the rules for each class. So I ended up having 5 sets of what we called house rules. And I read an article that explained how to let your students help you make the classroom expectations or classroom norms. And so we went through a process of brainstorming and then eliminating impossibilities. And then we chiseled it down, and I helped them with the wording, and this is what each class came up with. First period, of course they were first in the morning, so that's their list. 5th period, they didn't see first period's house rules, so I didn't let each class period of the day see what other class periods had done. And of course the wording's probably similar because I was helping them out, but the essence of the order and what they felt was important is all the kids. And this worked pretty well. I did have to have 5 different posters on my wall, and I had to think about which class period it was, but if you'll compare the list, you'll see that they turned out pretty similarly. Let's talk about consequences, because you will need to have a set of consequences that you fall back on when you've offered students clear expectations, you've possibly offered students a warning or a reminder, and then it's time for something else to happen. Something I'd like for you to try to think about is that consequences are not punishments, and I always tried to avoid, and I still on the school bus avoid that word. A consequence is more the result of a choice, and when your expectations are known and clearly explained for students, and they also know what will happen if they don't meet those expectations, then if they choose not to meet the expectations, the consequence is just the result of that choice. It's kind of like speeding. Everyone knows the speed limit. It's clearly established. Everyone knows that if you speed, you could get caught and you could get a ticket. So if I'm going 40 in a 30-mile-an-hour zone and I get pulled over, that police officer's not punishing me. That police officer's simply giving me the consequence, the known consequence of my choice. And I chose to speed, and so I get the consequence. So I always tried to be calm, cool, and collected when I'm dealing with students in discipline. And once I had established my clear expectations and the consequences were known, when someone didn't meet those expectations, I could talk to them privately and just say, so what happened? What's the expectation? What's the consequence? That's what you get, or I don't mean it like that's what you get, like you did a terrible thing. I just mean that is the result of your choice. You need reasonable, logical, and known consequences. Reasonable, appropriate for school, and reasonable given whatever the student has done. Logical, to me, this means that if I'm constantly interrupting class and I'm constantly causing you to, as the teacher, to have to stop, then bringing me in for lunch detention to basically kind of pay back the time, that's pretty logical. If I litter all over the classroom floor repeatedly, then cleaning up my own mess seems logical to me. Now, there's a whole world when we get deep into what's appropriate and inappropriate for students. So I always try to default on being not being thoughtful and careful, and always trying to imagine that I'm the parent of this child and would I appreciate the way this adult, basically stranger teacher, is dealing with my child. And so I do try to not let my own frustrations get in the way. And that's why a set of consequences that are already established and that are known is really the safest and for you and for the student path to follow, because you don't want to be making up consequences out of your head in a moment of frustration with a student. You will nearly always go over the top, and you might do or say or require something of a student that would be, in the moment it might seem appropriate, but it could also be inappropriate depending on the parent's viewpoint. Just to give you an example, there's a school, without naming the school, that there was a student that was making a mess in the cafeteria, and the consequence was not only for that student to clean up the mess that he made, but then the student was required to clean multiple tables, and this was in front of peers. This was an older student, and there was a lot of name calling from other students. The teacher didn't expect that to happen. The name calling was racist in nature. Teacher didn't see that coming. And then there was a lawsuit which the school had to settle. In other words, they ended up paying money because it was clear that the teacher had made a mistake and had humiliated the student beyond what was really necessary. In hindsight, I'm sure that the teacher and the school realized the student cleans up his mess, and then maybe a school consequence is applied, or maybe there's a phone call to a parent or guardian, but certainly not full-on public humiliation of the student. And I don't think that's what they intended, but I can imagine that in the moment there was such frustration that what seemed, oh, okay, you can clean 3 tables or 2 tables, no one thought about what was going to happen next. So you do have to be very, very careful when you're dealing with other people's kids and in situations that are public and where there are legal and ethical responsibilities. So be cautious as you go along. Strive for consistency. So what consequence is earned by one student, the same consequence is earned by a different student for the same situation. So you do want to be consistent along the way. And a list of consequences will help you do that. Why do you even need these? What you're trying to get students to do is take ownership of the behavior. To say, yes, I knew the expectation. Yes, I made this choice. That is on me. You also need students to resolve their issues, because often some students do all sorts of things. They stay in, quote, trouble. They don't meet expectations on a consistent basis, and you can help students figure out what it is that leads them to not meet these expectations and help them resolve their issues. And that's when it becomes more of a life lesson. When consequences are known and expectations are known and students are given opportunities to improve and they do not, then they get a consequence. They need to live with that choice. On my school bus, if a student is rowdy, then they sit in the front. They're going to sit near me so that I don't have to yell their name loudly to get their attention. I can turn my head quickly and see them and talk to them. So usually, especially with middle school kids, if I move them to the front of the bus, I'll usually say, you're going to sit up here, and they'll say, for how long? And I never give them a number. I always say, I don't know. We'll just have to see how it goes. And usually it's about a week. So about 2 or 3 days into sitting in the front, they'll often begin to tell me in conversation about how they are being so well behaved now, and they're really ready to go back to their old seat. And I really know that I shouldn't have done that. I won't do that again. Please let me go back to my seat. Please don't make me sit up here. And that's when I know, okay, this consequence is beginning to work, because they don't want to be up here any longer, and they're willing to start to try to bargain with me. And when I hear that, that means a couple more days will be enough to really drive home the point that I'm serious. So I typically don't let them out of the consequence early. That's when I'll say, all right, this is Wednesday, so next Monday you may go sit in your seat. And then they live with that consequence for the rest of that week. Or I could give them a specific number. I've learned to not give the number because often I'm frustrated and the number that I give in the moment will be far too big. They'll say, how long do I have to sit up here? And I'll be like, the rest of the year? And I just don't want to say that out loud so I usually say, I don't know yet. We'll have to see how this goes. And then when I'm calm, I can think, okay, probably 5 days is more reasonable than 180 if it's the beginning of the school year. And I think if you zoom out and look at this process, my personal children, I've applied this kind of stuff to them since they were little. So, knock on wood, my personal children are take pretty good care of their own behavior because they know that there are real consequences that they will encounter in our house if they don't do what they're supposed to do. But not all kids have that experience at home. So I think this is an opportunity for teachers and schools to help students realize there are consequences to choices. You can resolve your issues. It is important to take ownership of your own behavior, and you can change and you can take charge of your life and be a good citizen and a good member of a community and those sorts of larger ideas. Your job is to build in some consequences, and Classroom Management Plan Classroom Management Plan Part 2 asks you to do this when you're building your expectations. Some tips: use a hierarchy, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D, to promote some self-management in students. That way, if you're my students and the first level of consequence is a warning, then level 2 might be a conversation, a longer conversation with the teacher. Level 3 is something else. And what you're trying to get students to do is not climb that ladder. But you do want to have the hierarchy built so they understand what comes next. The consequences must be reasonable, but they also have to have a level of being uncomfortable for students. And I don't mean physically uncomfortable at all. I simply mean they don't want to have to do this because it disrupts what they like to do. And a classic example in elementary is missing part of recess. Most kids don't want to miss part of recess. Recess is golden opportunity to run and play, and when they miss part of it, they don't like that, and that's the uncomfortable level. Calling a student's family. Most of them don't want you calling if there's been a problem because many of them know they'll be in more trouble at home. So that to me is also a good example of a consequence that's reasonable and uncomfortable for the student. There's a researcher named Barbara Coloroso who has this great little list, RSVP, and I'm going to finish this video with this list. She says that great consequences are reasonable, and she means they're not too wimpy, like repeatedly giving students warning. They're also not over the top, like you have to sit in the front for the rest of the school year, sort of thing. They're reasonable. They're also simple, and she means that they're not complicated for you, the teacher, because if the consequences that you have set up and that students are choosing to get are complicated and make your teaching life more difficult because there's so many papers to sign, or it eats into your lunchtime on many, many days, then you're not as likely to follow through and do those things. So don't make consequence systems that are complicated for you as the teacher. They also must be valuable, so the student should learn something from the experience, and in a moment I'll show you a way to make that happen. And then she also says that they should be practical. It's useful, it has a purpose. And for example, I think if a student on my school bus, students that destroy seats, they have to pay for them. They have to pay for the price that it takes to recover that seat. Of course, I guess their parents end up paying for it, but that's reasonable. It's also simple for me. I think the student learns partly from the school, maybe partly from a parent, that things do have value and you should not destroy things that aren't yours. And it's practical because it restores the situation. So we'll pick up in the next video and we'll talk more about consequences and incentives.